My name is Dr. Raoul McLaughlin. Welcome to Ancient World Studies. This lecture is part of a series about the ancient African kingdoms. The previous lectures discussed the kingdom of Meroe. This talk considers the ancient kingdom of Aksum. I have written about ancient African kingdoms in my book, The Roman Empire and the Indian Ocean. The question is, how did the African king of ancient Aksum gain his power? Most of what is known about the early Aksumite kingdom comes from Roman merchant accounts. It is therefore worth studying these texts to discover how this African kingdom developed as an important regional power in the ancient economy. The vast Saharan desert confined the Romans to the Mediterranean, but there were other routes into Africa. Travelers could follow the Nile River south from Egypt into the ancient kingdom of Meroe, also known as Meroe. But there was another route the Romans used to reach African kingdoms, and this involved voyages through the Red Sea Gulf. Every year, large fleets of Roman merchant ships left the Red Sea ports in Egypt and sailed to distant kingdoms in Arabia, India, and East Africa. These voyages were timed to take advantage of powerful monsoon winds that blow seasonally across the ocean. The winds allowed rapid travel for ships that sailed hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles to reach their trading destinations. Accounts provided by merchants who sailed these routes reveal the existence of a rich and powerful commercial kingdom in northeast Africa. This kingdom was known as Aksum, which was also the name of its inland capital city. Eastern commerce was important to the Roman economy, as foreign kingdoms controlled many desirable items that could not be produced in the Mediterranean or northern Europe. For example, the Romans received spices, cottons, gemstones, and pearls from India. The Arabian kingdoms supplied valuable incense, including frankincense and myrrh. These were fragrant resins used for perfumes and religious ceremonies. Africa offered ivory and turtle shell, which could be carved into costly craft items, or used to decorate the surfaces of expensive furniture with colourful veneers. In Rome, the statesman and philosopher Seneca speculated in this market for luxury furniture, and was said to have stockpiled 500 tables made from African hardwoods, fitted with ivory legs. The Romans imposed a quarter-rate customs tax on all Eastern imports entering their empire. Consequently, trade conducted through the Red Sea supplied vast amounts of revenue. The ancient evidence suggests that a third of the revenue that the Roman state required to finance their empire came from taxing this commerce, conducted with Arabia, India, and East Africa. There were probably more than 100 ships involved in Roman trade with East Africa. This is confirmed by the Roman geographer Strabo, who mentions large fleets bound for India and East Africa in the same sentence. He confirms that, at this present time, large fleets are sent as far as India and the extremities of Africa, from which the most valuable cargoes are brought to Egypt. Elsewhere he reports that at least 120 ships sailed each year from Egypt to India. The Roman ships engaged in this commerce were probably more than 100 foot long, with a cargo capacity of over 200 tons. These vessels had to be large to withstand the monsoon weather, and to have the capacity to store provisions and equipment for crews and merchants who would spend months at sea on distant voyages. In total, the crew and passengers aboard a single vessel could include up to 50 people. Consequently, the seasonal arrival of these ships was an important event in foreign ports. Foreign kings took notice of these people and the valuable cargoes they offered in return for local products. This included the early rulers of Aksum, who established an important outpost on the East African coast. Roman voyages to Aksum are described in a merchant guidebook called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. This document was written in about AD 50 by a Greek-speaking merchant from Roman Egypt who sailed on voyages to northern India and describes many practices from personal experience. Unfortunately, the name of the author is not preserved in the surviving text, but he refers to the Indian Ocean and its gulfs as the Erythraean Sea. Wind conditions allowed Roman ships to make voyages down the African coast, any time from January to September, but most vessels travelling to Aksum set sail in September, nearly 2 months after their colleagues had left for India. This schedule meant they dominated the loading activities at Egyptian Red Sea ports during the month of August. It also allowed a prompt return when the incoming northeast monsoon reached Africa in November. To the south of Egypt, the African shoreline of the Red Sea was largely desolate. The seaboard was fronted by a 30-mile wide stretch of coast that was generally unsuitable for agriculture. Somewhere inland was the metropolis of Meroe, but this Nilotic kingdom had no trade presence on the Red Sea coast. Roman ships, sailing 450 miles down this coast, reached the first African trade station at a site called Ptolemais Theron, Ptolemais of the Hunts. This outpost was founded as an elephant hunting station by the Hellenic king Ptolemy II Philadelphus. In about 260 BC, Philadelphus sent expeditions of Greek mercenaries into the region to capture live elephants for his Near Eastern wars. A Greek general named Eumedes established Theron as a defensive outpost and enclosed a rare stretch of arable land suitable for farming. At first, the Greek intrusion was opposed by the local African population, but Eumedes was able to win their support. Strabo describes how, unannounced, Eumedes built a ditch and wall across the peninsula. Then, by his courteous treatment of those who tried to hinder his work, he persuaded them to be his friends instead of his foes. When the Greek hunters had decimated the nearby elephant herds, they moved their base camps to more distant coasts. Sometime after this, Theron came back under the control of the local population. The history of Theron was known to the author of the Periplus, who reports that in the days of the Ptolemies, the royal huntsmen made their way inland from this site. However, by the Roman period, there were no elephant herds nearby, and ivory could only occasionally be found at the settlement. The Periplus describes Theron as a small port of trade, and explains that the place has no harbour and only offers refuge to small craft. The main product on offer was turtle shell, obtained by offshore fishing, and a limited amount of small, light-coloured tortoise shields gathered from local land hunts. Few Roman ships stopped at Theron, and the Periplus does not recommend any cargo suitable for trade ashore. Pliny estimated that Ptolemy Theron was on the same latitude as Meroe, but the two sites were not connected by any significant trade routes. By the time of the Periplus, Theron was under the authority of an inland African kingdom named Aksum. The origins of the Aksumite kingdom are obscure, but the regime probably developed in highland Ethiopia during the early 1st century AD. However, the Aksumite kings quickly conquered outposts on the East African coast to form a trade connection to the Red Sea and its distant ocean sea lanes. The main trade port of the Aksumite kingdom was a Red Sea settlement called Adulis, which was about 340 miles or 5 days' sail south of Theron. Pliny calls the region Anzania, and uses accounts from the Augustan era in his description of its resources. He reports that large quantities of turtle were fished near islands in the Anzanian Sea, and most of this shell was brought to Adulis for international trade. Back in the Roman Empire, the shell was cut into panels and polished to decorate expensive furniture with lustrously patterned veneers. There were legends that Adulis was founded by runaway slaves from Egypt, and the settlement was therefore known as Freeman's Town. In reality, its origins were obscure, and it is possible that the site began as a Ptolemaic hunting station similar to Ptolemy's Theron. Like Theron, Adulis was situated on a small area of arable land that could support a permanent community with locally grown produce. Pliny describes early Adulis as a very large trading centre that is 5 days' sail from Ptolemy's Theron. He reports that African people brought to the site a large quantity of ivory, rhinoceros horn, hippopotamus hides, tortoiseshell, apes, and slaves. The Periplus describes Adulis as a legally limited port of trade, positioned on a deep bay that extended due south. This has been identified with Zula Gulf in modern Eritrea. In the time of the Periplus, the Aksumite kingdom had just seized control of the port, and the settlement was still vulnerable to attack from local raiders. Consequently, visiting merchants moved their operations about 20 miles offshore and occupied a small island opposite Zula Bay. The Periplus explains, at the present time, incoming vessels moor at Orene because of raids from the mainland. Adulis received traffic from both sides of the Red Sea and was visited by Arab ships from Yemen. Procopius reports that local ships took 5 days to cross the Gulf between Africa and Arabia, on sailings that continued throughout the night. In the time of the Periplus, Adulis was considered a fair-sized village, and its residents included Roman subjects who remained at the site all year round for trade purposes. During the 1st century AD, one of the main products shipped from Adulis was turtle shell, brought to the trade station by fishermen who hunted turtles around the sandy shores of nearby islands. The Periplus also describes a beach about 90 miles south of Adulis, where obsidian could be collected from black volcanic rocks buried deep beneath the sand. The area was claimed by the Aksumite kingdom, but the regime had not begun to fully exploit this valuable resource. Pliny reveals that the Romans used obsidian to make cult statues and dark mirrors that reflected shadows rather than clear images. A flake of obsidian could also be used to test precious stones, since it would scratch a white mark on any glass copies. The Aksumites controlled the ivory trade and sent the product to Adulis via an Ethiopian city named Kole. The Periplus describes Kole as the first trading station for ivory, and reports that the city was 3 days inland from Adulis. Roman merchants making this journey had the option to travel further inland to the Ethiopian capital, Aksum, situated 5 days from Kole and a total of 8 days from the coast. The Periplus calls Aksum a metropolis, which confirms its position as the capital of the Aksumite kingdom. The city stood in the fertile highlands of northern Ethiopia, in a region grazed by herds of forest elephants and white rhino. The Periplus explains that into Aksum is brought all the ivory from beyond the Nile and the Canenion for transport down to Adulis. The Canenion could be the Teketsi River, which flowed through deep canyons to join with the Blue Nile. The Periplus reports that the mass of elephants and rhinos that are slaughtered inhabit the upland regions, though on rare occasions they can also be seen along the shore near Adulis. Evidence for the commercial rise of the Aksumite kingdom comes from the discovery of fragments of 1st century Roman glassware near the site of the ancient capital, along with contemporary coins minted by Arab regimes in Yemen. In AD 50, the Ethiopian king Scalas had his royal court at Aksum, and from there he controlled the traffic in ivory and horn. These products probably entered the Aksumite treasury as taxes from subject communities, tribute from vassal peoples, and income from royal hunts. Roman traders offered commonplace and inexpensive goods to the merchants at Adulis, who dealt in ivory and turtle shell. These included large quantities of Egyptian fabric, including linens, double-fringed items, scarves, and coloured cloaks made from printed cloth. Roman merchants also traded in vividly coloured glass stones and glass globes with multicoloured millefiori decorations made in Egypt. These gem-like items were probably used in local jewellery and attached as ornamental fittings to other objects. Many of the goods offloaded at Adulis would have been delivered or passed on to consumers in the Ethiopian cities of Kole or Aksum. There was a market for low-value Roman metals in Ethiopia, and Aksumite traders accepted brass and copper pans and cups from the empire. The African craftsmen cut apart these metal objects to make decorative armlets and anklets for local women to wear. Sheets of copper and brass were also cut into regular pieces to serve as token coinage in the kingdom. There was demand for Roman woodworking tools in the Aksumite kingdom, including axes and knives. Local iron supplies were insufficient or of poor quality, so Roman traders provided local dealers with iron to manufacture better weapons for hunting and warfare. The Periplus explains, Roman iron was used in spears for use on elephants and other wild animals and for war. There were foreign traders residing long-term in the Aksumite kingdom, including Roman subjects who sourced and stockpiled African goods for export to the empire. The Periplus therefore advised visiting traders to bring a little Roman money for the resident foreigners. These dealers were also prepared to accept a limited quantity of Italian wine and olive oil as an alternative to cash, since these essential Mediterranean goods were not produced in Ethiopia. Royal agents probably controlled the bulk of ivory stocks available in the Aksumite kingdom, and the Periplus records that most of the valuable goods sent into the region were destined for the king. The Aksumite king, Scalas, was on good terms with the Romans who visited his royal court, but he was notorious as a hard bargainer when it came to making deals with foreign merchants. The Periplus reports that Scalas is astute about his possessions, and in his dealings with us he is always holding out for more, but in all other respects he is a fine person, and he is well versed in Greek reading and writing. Roman dealers offered Scalas valuable gold and silver tableware from the empire that had been fashioned in the local manner. In the Aksumite court, communal drinking and feasting from expensive tableware was an important social feature. The Ethiopian highlands experienced cold winters, so the Aksumite king also valued batches of heavy Roman cloaks, said to be without adornment. These garments were probably issued to Aksumite soldiers and royal retainers in the African capital. Roman merchants also offered King Scalas valuable goods from India in order to acquire precious stocks of African ivory. This included Indian iron and steel produced using Eastern techniques unknown to Roman metalworkers. The king also accepted Indian fabrics, waistbands, and a limited amount of cotton clothing. A final commodity on the trade list is Indian lac dye, which the Aksumite king possibly used to equip his royal soldiers or court officials with distinctive scarlet-coloured uniforms. This connection with the ancient world economy allowed the Aksumite kingdom to increase in wealth and power. The Aksumite king, Endubus, who came to power in AD 270, began minting the first gold and silver currency produced by the regime. These coins were modelled on Roman issues and proclaimed in Greek script that Endubus was king or emperor of Aksum. The king and his successors are depicted wearing a bandana-like headscarf that might have been a ceremonial indicator of rank or status. In the 4th century AD, Aksumite rulers turned their ambitions north towards the Nile and conquered the neighbouring African kingdom of Meroe. Around this period, the rulers of Aksum also adopted Christianity, following the conversion of the Roman emperors. By AD 400, the Aksumite king Aeon is depicted on his gold coins, wearing an elaborate crown, similar to the headgear worn by Eastern monarchs, including the Persians of Iran. To learn more about ancient African kingdoms, subscribe to my channel. You can find a link below to my book, The Roman Empire and the Indian Ocean. Thank you.